Shalom, y'all. Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. Tonight's program is part of the Markel Family Jewish Literary and Arts Festival at the Memphis Jewish Community Center. I want to send a shout out to the inimitable Marcy Stagner, Program Director Extraordinaire, who made this event possible. We wish her a refuah shlema, and we hope that she's feeling well enough to be watching, and also to Carrie Webb, who is running the show for us tonight. I'm Jonathan Judakin, Professor of History at Rhodes College and coordinator of the Communities in Conversation series at Rhodes. I'm going to be joined on this panel by my colleague Justin Rose, who is Dean for Faculty Recruitment, Development, and Diversity, and a professor in the Politics and Law Department at Rhodes. Tonight is co-sponsored by Africana Studies and Jewish, Islamic, and Middle East Studies at Rhodes, affectionately known as the JIMES program. I want to also say a big thank you to Beth Shalom Synagogue as our other community sponsor, and send props out to Lorraine Wolf and the Jewish Historical Society of Memphis and the Mid-South for helping us spread the word. Tonight's program, as you know, is a conversation with Marc Dollinger, Professor of Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University, about his book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s, which has been a touchstone in conversations about the relationship between Blacks and Jews in the age of Black Lives Matter since it was published 3 years ago. We're going to proceed this evening with Justin and I bouncing back and forth with a series of questions for Marc that will take us through the first 45 minutes or so this evening. Throughout, we encourage you to submit questions into the Q&A. And in the last 30 minutes or so, Justin and I will read or will paraphrase your questions. Since time is short and the issues raised by Black Power Jewish politics so rich, I want to jump right in. Marc, your book revises the usual story about the relationship between Blacks and Jews in the era of the Civil Rights Movement, especially in the aftermath of the rise of Black Power in the 1960s. Can you start tonight with reprising for us the received narrative about Blacks and Jews, and then sketch the big argument that you make in the book and the ways in which that conventional narrative needs to be reconsidered?
Yeah, thanks so much. Honored to be here. And I just want to note my wife, Marcy, is a native of Memphis. So it's great to be in Memphis, if only on Zoom. So the story of white Jews and Blacks in the Civil Rights Movement, I think, is one of the most popular sort of renditions in American Jewish history. And I'll sort of insert myself and date myself. I was raised in the 1970s in the suburbs of Los Angeles. And there we learned the story of a natural alliance between Blacks and Jews, especially in the Civil Rights Movement. We learned about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his close friendship with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. We learned, and all this is true, right, that in many cases, a majority of the white civil rights activists identified as Jewish. And this story kind of takes us from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. And sometime in the mid-60s, the rise of Black radicalism and nationalism emerges. According to the historiography, according to the historical writing on the topic, this is where Black militants, as they were described, were purging otherwise benevolent Jews from their organizations. There was a rise of anti-Israel and anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And essentially, it's what we lovingly call the community relations go smash model. That it worked out well for 10 years and then it didn't. And typically, certainly in the journalistic accounts and even some of the historical accounts, blame is pretty focused on those in the Black community that appear to be turning their backs on King and his message, of interracial cooperation. And I'll defer to my colleague, on that particular field. So I opened up this book project actually not interested at all in Black Power. I was interested in the Jewish ethnic and religious revival of the 1970s. It was, to be honest, a journey in self-discovery, because that's the decade I was raised. And as I learned about, the Soviet Jewry movement, about the rise of American Zionism, about the rise of Jewish neoconservatism, a Jewish religious revival, the sources just kept mentioning the words Black Power. And I thought, this is fascinating. And so I started in the 70s, and then I moved back to the 60s and began to see overt connections between the way, now I'm talking about leaders of Jewish organizations, viewed Black Power in ways that were far more empathetic and sympathetic than I had certainly thought growing up. And in fact, they were even talking about ways in which the rise of Black militancy could empower Jewish ethnic identity. That Jews were so afraid to be public about being Jewish, and Black Power expanded the bounds of acceptable ethnic expression. We'll get into more detail, but the Soviet Jewry movement, right, is a great example of that happening. And then I just kept getting drawn further back in history, and I went to the 1950s. And here I was utterly stunned to find in the archives documents that were actually published. So you don't have to look that hard. You just have to get the newsletter of that Jewish organization, where these were mostly white male, middle-aged leaders of Jewish organizations that were pretty keyed into the fact that there's limits to white Jewish liberalism. There's limits to white Jewish alliance in the civil rights movement. It's gonna get bad, hold on. And even things as radical to my mind as sort of minimizing Black anti-Semitism, which is not, and then I realized, wow, I said, first of all, I'm just stunned that it was so easy to find these documents and they hadn't been written before. So this is about history, it's about historiography, the way in which different generations of scholars write, but it's also about historical memory. That is, what sorts of things do we like to remember about our history? What kinds of things do we sort of conveniently set aside? And what's the role of a scholarly historian to try to bring it back? So that's probably the best quick overview I can give.
Yeah, thank you. I found this narrative compelling and elegant. But one of the things I noticed as the decades moved on, there seemed to be a shift from what you might call a genuine alliance to more of opportunities where Jewish leaders were offering support as opposed to alliance. So I wonder, are those two the same thing? Should they be teased out a bit? And if they're not the same thing, if there was a move from, say, an alliance to support, do you really tell a different narrative, or was it true that the alliance was actually splintering?
Thank you. So, I'll ask back maybe rhetorically, on how you're defining alliance and support. My sense is an alliance is a deeper connection and support is sort of not so much. And now it's going to get a little tricky and a little messy. So I just want to say there's like lots of Jewish people in America, and lots in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and lots of different Jews were doing lots of different things at different times. And it's both and in many ways. So what I'm saying is not meant to undermine the alliance for those who were engaged in the alliance, as much as it is to say that there was a whole lot more going on that academic historians have not also added to the story. And when we add it to the story, it becomes more complicated. So let me just go back and talk about the alliance. So the historiography is, it was a good alliance, and then it splintered. I revised that. Especially, and even among those who were actively engaged in the alliance, and it was a disproportionate number of white Jews who were doing it, they understood the limitations of the alliance. They understood that being white in America was very different than being Black in America. They understood what they were trying to do as allies. And when the alliance broke up, 10 years later, my sense is that the activists were unsurprised. So I'm as much interested in the surprise among some Jews, and these would have been the ones who were not actually going to the South. I'll just want to jump in here if I can with the historiography. And normally there are three reasons given to explain why white Jews would be disproportionately involved in the movement for civil rights. The first is history. Jews have a bad history, Blacks have a bad history. When you got common bad histories, you come together. Second, that is sociology, which is white Jews and Blacks know what it is to be sociological marginalized. And when you have two marginalized communities, of course they're going to come together. And the third one is a religion argument, which is Judaism, prophetic Judaism, what we now call tikkun olam, to repair the world. It's actually required for Jews to be involved in this. Well, when I got involved in the research, we'll start with history. The American Jewish historical experience could not be more different than the African-American historical experience. African-American history begins in centuries of slavery and now beyond. Jewish American experience by the second generation is moving into the middle class. There is, of course, Holocaust consciousness, which is going to play into this for a lot of these young Jews that happened in Europe. But I share the story of a Black sociologist of ethnicity and race, a colleague of mine, who used to be the co-chair of the state of New Jersey's Black Jewish Alliance, which he told me meant he gets invited to a lot of Passover Seders every spring. And he said that if another white Jewish person says that they know what it's like to be a Black man in America because we too were slaves in the land of Egypt, he's going to scream, you know? So the first awareness is the subtlety that the historical argument is really more complicated than it looks. And sociologically speaking, and this is really Eric Goldstein's work, and Karen Brodkin did it as well on Jews and whiteness, Jews don't really form an interracial alliance until after World War II, when it is that Jews achieve integration into the white suburban suburbs. If it's true that sociologically marginalized groups are going to come together, this should have happened, 50 or 100 years earlier. And the most painful revision is that Judaism, well, most of the young activists, the college students who went back, were not going down with Jewish organizations. They were not going down as Jews per se. Now, one of my colleagues at Brandeis argues that rejection of one's Jewish identity is an embrace of it, which could be interesting. But there is a lot of sort of ownership of these people as Jews. And to put it in the most blunt terms, if Judaism argues for anti-Black racist work for white Jews, we should see the Orthodox community, those for whom the 613 commandments following every day is the goal, they should be in the lead. In fact, there were very few Orthodox. There were a couple rabbis, but very few. The conservative movement, of course, is where Rabbi Heschel came, and he was all but excommunicated by the Jewish Theological Seminary for kind of wasting his time on something that wasn't Jewish. The reform movement of the denominations had most, but as I said, and I know we're being recorded, but I do have tenure, so I'll just say it. There were Jewish socialists and communists who were involved, and there was a leftism, which was actually anti-religion. So as a scholar sitting in the archives, I just saw all of this stuff just everywhere, and realized it was time for a new book.
So I want to say again that folks should put their questions into the Q&A, since in a way, Marc's already articulated some of the controversial aspects of his revisionist account here. And I appreciate that question that Justin asked that sort of helped Marc to talk about differences amongst Jews between alliance and support. But Marc, I want you to drill a little bit deeper into what you raised about Jews and whiteness in your response. Part of what you've argued is that there were rifts that were beginning to open up between Jews and Blacks already at the height of the civil rights movement, and that Jewish leaders were talking about this openly, and that partly this had to do with a strong awareness about the role of whiteness in America. So tell us a little bit more about these rifts and how you historicize them in terms of Jews becoming white folks and what that means about race in America. to reference the title of Karen Brodkin's book that you talked about and that Eric Goldstein so brilliantly analyzes?
Yeah, thank you. This is a really big question, and I'm going to rely on my colleagues because I actually don't write and publish on whiteness per se. The argument goes, by the way, racial privilege is conferred and it's socially constructed. This is fancy words to say a person doesn't actually have to try or agree with whatever racial privilege or non-privilege they get. It just kind of exists. And I'm a professor of Jewish studies, and I love studying Jews around this because Jews in some time periods and some places have not been white, even if they're presenting as white. And at other times, they definitely are. So this has been, especially since the racial reckoning began after the murder of George Floyd, something that a lot of sort of white Jewish liberals are coming to terms with. So in the 1950s, this was the moment when Jews were received and welcomed. So there were anti-Semitic restrictions in housing covenants. There were also anti-Black restrictions. So after World War II, the Jewish ones went away, but the Black ones didn't. So what we have in this moment, and on one hand, I'll say it was not intentional, right? On the other hand, when white Jews achieve the American dream and get into the suburbs and get that house and the yard that they always wanted, they're now living in a racially segregated neighborhood. They're fully complicit in a system of institutionalized racism around housing. So what I found when I was reading the Jewish leaders was that they were talking about it out loud, you know, and they were talking about it to one another, and they were sharing it, you know, with their communities. The Nation of Islam is actually chapter 1 of the book. And that was, of course, the most shocking realization I had about how much in the 1950s white Jewish leaders were understanding the deep relevance and limits of white Jewish liberalism than at least I would have imagined or thought that they did. And then I'll just jump in for today, you know, because there's been a lot of attention on this in the last 2 years, and perhaps folks, you know, are interested in it. It's about American Jewish exceptionalism. I probably should have opened with that. There is an overarching thesis that America is exceptional, which means it's different and better for Jews than any other place in any other time, with the possible exception of the state of Israel, right? That the story of America is the story of greatness for American Jews. And what I found in the sources and what I argue in the book is that Jews weren't all that exceptional. I mean, on the one hand, yes, we were exceptional because there's a disproportionate number, and that's well described in the literature. And what we're finding, you know, now in 2021 is that there is racial privilege around white Jews after World War II, and certainly today. And there's still, I think, a lot of folks who haven't sort of put together the pieces that one can be both white and privileged at the same time one is Jewish and suffering anti-Semitism. Because that's what's so hard, because we have a spike in anti-Semitism now in the last 5 years, which of course drives us in one direction in our historical understanding. At the same time, there's a lot of pushing that white Jews are privileged on the other, and it's really hard for folks to live in that space.
So I'm going to follow up with one more question, if that's okay, Justin. It sounds to me, Mark, like in actuality, the story about American exceptionalism oftentimes isn't itself connected to the story about whiteness. And that's part of the problem, that the story of Jewish exceptionalism in the United States is connected to the fact that they were benefactors of white privilege from the moment that they landed on American shores. But one of the aspects about American history, really up until the Holocaust, is that it was the story of a melting pot, that people came here and sort of melted into the broader cultural fabric. And for Jews, ultimately, this meant a process of assimilation and a refusal most of the time, even amongst communal organizations, to actively and affirmatively assert aspects of communal identity that weren't framed in terms of what it meant to be an American. So This presents an enigma, of course, in terms of the history of Zionism, because that immediately then invokes issues of double allegiance. Now, some scholars have argued that the rise of Zionism in America, and we should all remember that the support for Zionism was a minority position in the United States and really everywhere in the world until after the Holocaust amongst Jews. But some have argued that the rise of Zionism and strong communal identification across the Jewish community with Zionism was much more animated by the Six-Day War than it was by anything else. You make a paradoxical argument that despite the fact that Black nationalists often supported the Palestinian cause, that Black power and Black nationalism actually enabled the support of Zionism. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you. So first, I'm going to engage in hopeless reductionism. I'm going to define Zionism as moving to Israel. Now, since Louis Brandeis wrote a very famous piece at the beginning of the 20th century where you get to be a Zionist and not move there, I want to tie it to the exceptionalist thesis. That is, the basic idea of modern political Zionism is Jews are not safe if they're living in a country that's not run by Jews. That anti-Semitism is happening everywhere all the time, and Zionism is the answer. Therefore, as you pointed out, Zionism has been a minority movement among American Jews. In fact, there's been anti-Zionism throughout the 19th century before the Eastern Europeans arrived, because they don't need to go to Ottoman or British Mandate Palestine. They've got their, perfect life, as it were, here in the United States. So after the Shoah, by the way, I also want to add, with the Eastern European Jewish immigration of 2 million people at the turn of the 20th century, there were Zionists. They were labor Zionists, Bundists, there were factions, and putting them aside, certainly in the 1950s, after the state of Israel is created and Jews are now, going into the white suburbs and getting accepted as Jews, Judeo-Christianity is coming up. One of my favorite stories I told in my first book, the Anti-Defamation League called a public high school because they're making the kids sing Christmas carols. And they're like, don't do that. Well, the Jewish parents at the high school called the ADL and said, knock it off. We've worked so hard to get our kids included in the Christmas carols. We don't want to bring them out. So in the 1950s, I argue that the liberal Cold War consensus really brought Jews into the center politically, and really made them quite hesitant to announce themselves as Jews. And so most folks look at the Six-Day War in 1967 as the thing that changed it. I was doing the research. I was like, no, actually, what happened in 64, 65, especially, this is when much of the tensions between white Jews and Blacks occurred. This is when the purging of at least white Jewish leaders from places like SNCC occurred. And what do? If you're a good-hearted white Jewish liberal wanting to work for racial justice and you feel like you've just been, just pushed out. And between 64, 65, 66, there's just a lot of tension and a lot of political energy from young Jewish progressives that can't find their spot. And then in less than a week, the state of Israel has a dramatic military victory. The response of American Jews to 67 surprised even American Jewish leadership. Something like 97% of American Jews expressed strong sympathy with Israel after the war. I don't think we're getting 97% of American Jews, today involved in this. 7,500 college students got their passports and got on planes and flew there. The United Jewish Appeal Campaign doubled the year after 67 than the year before. And I argue that that was the perfect time for a Jewish nationalist movement to occur, because Jews were watching, and it wasn't just Black Power, it was also MECHA, we're a little early for National Organization for Women, the American Indian movement. In 68, 69, there's going to be Alcatraz Island taken over by indigenous people. And they got with the picture. And I argue that Six-Day War is a trailing indicator of Black Power rather than leading. And then I started looking at rabbi sermons around the Six-Day War. and the number of rabbis, and I've got the quotes in the book, that specifically mentioned that Black power is what they called Negro Zionism, using the phrase of the era. And in fact, were pleading with their congregants, their white Jewish congregants, that everything Jews are doing around a renewed Zionism is precisely what Black power activists are trying to do within their own community. And this is where I make the argument that there is a new alliance. It's a parallel alliance. So we're not arm in arm anymore, but certainly on the ethnic nationalism side, they're both following that path.
This is really fascinating. I want to maybe switch gears for a second, though, and kind of go back to talking about that history and some of the issues, right? So one of the things I found really fascinating was the ways in what you said, like there were different Jewish people, right? And they had different interests. And so I want to ask this question, but I want to start with a disclaimer, right? I asked this question fully cognizant of the composition of this panel, but in particular, when you were talking about affirmative action, you talked about, there were different Jewish views on affirmative action. And you say that there was a lack of a gendered analysis by those who simplistically claimed that affirmative action was, quote, bad for Jews. You offer, had they considered Jewish women, then they would have had to recast their opinion or their rationale for opposing the measures. Can you say a little more about this claim and comment on other ways that you feel that there's a lack of a gendered analysis when talking about this Black-Jewish alliance?
Yeah, thank you. So I've been interested in affirmative action for a few books now. So I've done a bunch of research on it. And one thing that just startled me in terms of at least the primary sources is I can't find in the traditional sources, I'm not finding it, right? The second issue of Tikkun magazine has an article hypothesizing probably that white Jewish women did well in affirmative action. And Irving Howe, along with Bernard Rosenberg, Irving Howe with the famous World of Our Fathers book, he's got about a paragraph on it. But other than that, I didn't find much. And what I found fascinating here, and I want to expand it to two things. One is gender, and the other is the difference between affirmative action and quotas, and how at least organized Jewish community responded to those. So when I'm teaching this, I say, what group benefit most from affirmative action? And if they don't know that I'm tricking them on every question up till now, they're supposed to raise their hand and say Blacks or Latinx, or Indigenous, right? Come up with a historically marginalized racial minority. And then I always, just to throw it in, I say, and by the way, Jews were not considered a designated minority group in terms of the federal government at the time of affirmative action, right? To have them take off the Jews, which is probably where they think I was going. And then, of course, the answer is Jews, because women are designated by the federal government as an historical minority. And white Jewish women were disproportionately leaving high school and going to college, disproportionately going to college to grad school, and disproportionately looking for professional positions. So, and I did not do the research, and I really, in the book, I wanted this to be a call to those who specialize in gender studies to say, A, we need to learn this, but B, what I was really interested in is why in the historiography and in historical memory do so many Jews oppose affirmative action, making the meritocracy argument should be based on merit and nothing else. And they're completely oblivious to the fact that Jews, white Jews, actually benefit more than any other group. And the fact that it happens to be women now puts of course, the misogynist or sexist part into that. So that's the affirmative action piece. When it moved to quotas, almost every Jewish organization supported affirmative action in theory. There were some of these sort of what we call ultra-Orthodox groups that didn't. But when it came to quotas, almost everybody outside of the far left rejected quotas because they said, Jews don't like quotas. Quotas are anti-Semitic. We know about anti-Semitic quotas because in the 1920s, you couldn't get into Harvard because they had anti-Semitic quotas. And here's the counter argument to that. Quotas were put in the 1920s to keep white people in power and communities of color on the margin. In the 1920s, Jews were not considered white, so there was an anti-Jewish quota at Harvard. In the Great Society with Lyndon Johnson, he flipped it. Now, of course, affirmative action would be great, but as we learned, like in Boston municipality, doesn't matter how much you're going to tell them you need to do it. At a certain point, the judge has to say we need a strict quota for the purpose of bringing in marginalized communities who are suffering from racism, and now, if anything, pushing out sort of white America. So I would argue if one is simply a self-interested Black in the 1920s, you hated quotas and you loved them in the 60s, and if you're a white Protestant, you flip it. I think Jews are the only group that hated them both times. And to me, that's evidence that between the 20s and the 60s, Jews became white. Jews moved on the social hierarchy.
At least as I understand it, and maybe I'm getting this wrong, but sorry, was I muted? At least as I understand it, part of your argument about affirmative action is that Jews were ambivalent about affirmative action, and that ambivalence stemmed from this prior history, this prior assimilationist approach that affirmative action was group-based, a group-based conferral of certain kinds of rights, and that Jews inherently were tacked to liberalism's notion of individual rights, and that's part of what they ended up finding problematic about affirmative action. It was a mark in a shift in Jewish politics. So I want to use that as a question to segue into a different aspect of your argument, which has to do with the rise of Soviet Jewry. Can you talk a little bit about the ways in which Black Power, your argument about how Black Power facilitated support for the movement to free Soviet Jewry? It's another one of the sort of paradoxical arguments that you make in the course of the book.
Yeah, one of the intellectually fun parts about this is that the Soviet Jewry movement burned the Cold War anti-communist candle on both ends, which means on the one hand, this was a movement by Jews for Jews. Out in the streets, 10,000 people protesting for their brethren, who are being persecuted. On the other hand, they used Cold War anti-communism to get the US Senate to pass the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. Because to be honest, the US Senate will be less interested in freeing Soviet Jews and more interested in making the communists look bad. So it was a really nice, strategy in terms of moving things forward. Well, I was reflecting on an ahistoric question, right? If anti-communism is going to be the way that American Jewish leaders can get the federal government on board, they should have started this movement in the mid-50s at the height of McCarthyism. That's when Cold War anti-communism would have been at its strength. The Soviet Jewry movement did not nationalize until 1964. So my question as an observer is, why did it wait 10 years? And by the way, the state of Israel was fighting for Soviet Jews from day one, There was a pause here. And I'm arguing that while these parents of these kids doing Christmas carols in the 1950s suburbs don't want the ADL to stop it, they're also not going to go, past their white picket fence with giant signs and protest in the streets for particular Jewish rights. So I argued that the Black Power movement generally emboldened lots of ethnic, racial, gender groups in the 1960s to protest for their own particular interests. And I think that happened. And I'll give a very specific example. Sholem McGee just published a great new book on Meir Kahane and the Jewish Defense League. He really was one of the early public advocates for Soviet Jewry, and he was the one telling Jewish organized leaders that they weren't doing enough. And he was on the political right, and he was a racist, and it was pretty awful if you look at what he's saying. And he loved the Black Panther Party. He loved the Black Panther Party because they got guns and they protected their people. And he's like, that's what Jews have to do too. We have to get guns and protect our people. So here's a paradox, right? While he was also getting armed Jews, protecting working class white Jews in now Black dominant neighborhoods. While he's doing that, he's also preaching the Black Panther Party handbook and arguing that Soviet Jewry needs to follow in that more militant style.
So, as you know, we're having this conversation in the wake of the trial for those who killed Ahmaud Arbery, and the Kyle Rittenhouse trial is going on as well in the aftermath, the shooting that took place in the aftermath of Kenosha, Wisconsin. And so your book has been a touchstone in the moment of racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd. So can you talk a little bit about why the history that you tell is important for Jews as they wrestle with issues of racism in America and with the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just open by saying that I was quite surprised by the reaction to the book initially, and then after the murder of George Floyd, I think I was less surprised. What I've done is basically sort of open with what I think a whole lot of us in white American Jewish life kind of internalized without thinking, and gave a very different story. And what I noticed, when the book first came out, is I was getting a lot of feedback from Jews of color, and especially Black Jews, who of course had lots of critiques, of the book, and also, argued that this is sort of the first time their understanding of the limits of white Jewish liberalism has been expressed in a scholarly book, not to mention by a white man. So it picked up there. And then once the murder occurred and CNN and all the cable stations are doing like 24/7 coverage, I'm getting 5 to 8 emails a day, mostly from synagogues, sometimes from JCCs. And the leadership is like, my community is like stuck in that old view that you described. Would you sort of re-explain Jews and race in post-World War II America so that we can get a better sense of what's going on now and how white Jews fit into it? And I am keeping track. I'll tell you, this is the 125th Zoom class I've done on this topic since George Floyd. It really is about undermining the exceptionalist thesis. And it's really hard to sort of say, how can we as white Jews, who are, by the way, Jews are the most liberal white ethnic group in America, something between 80 and 85% vote Democratic. Only African Americans vote Democratic more than Jews. So how can a group that is so progressive and so historically committed to and victimized by anti-Semitism in these last 5 years also be getting caught up in this notion of white supremacy? And I think really there's just been a profound interest in understanding.
Well, I was actually going to tack to some of the questions, and we've gotten some really excellent questions in the Q&A, and we'll follow up with those. But since you mentioned white supremacy, and since the other trial that is going on at the moment is the trial about the Unite the Right organizers, I want to ask you, Marc, about the controversy that's arisen around your book. Apparently, with the 4th printing of the book, you were asked by the press, Brandeis University Press, to write a new preface. And then, as a result of what you wrote in that preface, they apparently handed you back the rights to the book, which is now going to be published by University of Chicago. And this was because you wrote that suburban white Jews were increasingly recognizing how their upward mobility had, and here I'm quoting the foreword now, quote, reinforced elements of white supremacy in their own lived experience. And apparently, it's your use of the words white supremacy, which obviously can mean at least 2 different things, right? One is the kind of white supremacy that we see at the Unite the Right rally. It's about people who put on white sheets and defend the Confederate flag and Confederate statues. And but there's also white supremacy in the sense of hegemony, cultural dominance, and which groups organize and structure and benefit from structures and institutions historically, right? So can you talk a little bit about the controversy the rift, the controversy with Brandeis University Press, how it came about, and why you ended up moving away from the press or why they moved away from you and you've gone to University of Chicago.
Yeah, thank you. So first, just for technical, I'm not actually with the University of Chicago. University of Chicago has distribution rights for Brandeis University Press. I have not yet signed a contract on a new press, and so I can't announce where it's going to be, but it will be moving on. I wrote the new preface, and I was told to write on how the themes of the book are reflected in the current political climate. It's basically a puff piece because, they were excited that the book was relevant, and it was just, I think it's about 2 years to go through 3 printings, so that was good. And I received feedback in an email that they were concerned about my use of the words white supremacy and my use of the word Jews of color. There are actually 2. So I actually didn't know that I wrote white supremacy in it. I actually did a word search just to establish the point that the new preface was not about white supremacy. It was actually about the themes, of the book related to now. Sure enough, turns out I used it 3 times. And a 4th time I talked about the supremacy of white people, which tells me I knew I did it 3 times. I had to find a different way to say it. And then and by the way, inevitably when this happens and someone calls, you're like, okay, I probably said something I didn't mean. I'll go change it, So I go to read it, but the very next day, I actually got another email telling me that there's no chance to revise. There's no chance to discuss it. They've already sent it in for its 4th printing without the new preface, and they were done with it. Well, of course, I go and I read, what I wrote, and Jonathan, you were correct about the closeness of these words, and part of it is it's a linguistic challenge, but to be honest, in real, white supremacy is a system that makes white people supreme. Just be direct like that. A white supremacist is what's going on in Charlottesville. They kill Jews while they pray. So I appreciate that it's very hard for white Jewish people to see the closeness between white supremacy and white supremacist. But as a scholar, the notion that the United States is built on a system of white supremacy, and as soon as Jews are benefiting from that system, especially since World War II, that we become a part of and complicit, and that actually is very relevant to the interracial relationships, as I wrote in the book. I actually didn't think that was controversial. The second piece was, I didn't talk about Black Jews in the book, and that was my mistake. I didn't talk about Black Jews in specific, nor did I talk about the way in which white racial identity is a causal factor to understand what happened. I talked about the 60s as a causal factor, Black power as a causal factor, the Cold War, as a causal factor. And Ilana Kaufman, who is the founder and CEO of the Jews of Color Initiative, fortunately, I gave her the manuscript ahead of time before it got published, and she called me out, and she was right. So I wrote an epilogue where I basically, called out the need and the ways in which this book, and I like to think it made contributions, and it's also quite limited by my racial status, that we need to step up. So the Jewish newspapers picked it up, but they picked up the white supremacy part, not the Jews of color part. And in the back and forth, the press decided to give the book back. I didn't ask for it back. They said, we're going to give it back to you as soon as we're done with the printing. So that's the quick overview.
Thanks for sharing that. I think at this point, we're going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. And so Beth Lieberman asked us, what do you see as the important issues now that we can act on to forge new alliances or strengthen what now exists?
All right, I'm going to give you my snarky answer first, and then I'll give you a serious one. The snarky one is, I'm an historian. It's tough enough to predict the past. I'll look to my social science, politics colleagues to try to predict the future, and to say, of course, this is really on the top of everybody's minds. And for me, and the work that I'm trying to do, around these book talks, is pause. Let's just stop. Let's pause, take a deep breath, and do some reflection on a new understanding, a reinvention, as I called it in the book, of this relationship. And get educated, right? First, I think that's vital to be informed on a very different approach to this. And a lot of the controversy around the book was like folks who didn't like the new approach. So I'll say, if you want to understand what's going on today, get with the new approach. And then be in relationship. And I'll just speak hopefully as an ally to fellow white Jews who are listening. It matters a whole lot more to be in an ongoing relationship with folks rather than just to drop in a particular moment. because you need to do that to establish trust, and you need to do that to listen and to learn as well. Generally, folks have professions or hobbies, and I would say go to your professional organization or whatever you're interested in, because I'm sure there's racism there, and I'm sure they are doing some kind of DEI initiative work there, and see how you can sign up and continue to learn.
So I want to follow up with kind of an issue about some of the ways in which what you're suggesting as ways of moving forward end up getting short-circuited. And I want to do so by asking a question from Charlie Belinky, who asks you to address the question of Black anti-Semitism and Jewish anti-Blackness. He asked you to speak about it in Memphis in particular. I don't know if you've got enough nose to the, to the local situation to be able to speak about that, but you can certainly speak about it in broader terms in American society today.
Yeah, thank you. Sadly, I don't know enough about Memphis to speak to it. So I want to quote Eric Ward, first of all, one of the great civil rights activists now. And he said, when I was on a panel with him, he said, he studied anti-Semitism, and he's a Black man. And he said, I've realized the #1 cause of anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism, which is to say, we overplay the phrase Black anti-Semitism. Because Black community, like the Jewish community, like the white Jewish community, is incredibly diverse, and there's lots of stuff, going on in all of the various communities. There's going to be folks who are anti-Semitic everywhere, and the notion of making a direct association between someone's racial status and whether or not they're anti-Semitic is in of itself, problematic. So that would be on the phrase Black anti-Semitism. On Jewish anti-Black racism. Yeah, so I'm presenting this in 3 ways historically. That is moments when in American Jewish history, Jews have been outright blatant racists, right? There were some Jews who were slaveholders, right? That they were not disproportionate. They did not control the slave trade. And if you were white and Jewish in the Deep South during slavery and you had money, chances are you were a slave owner too. And that's sort of a piece of the story that generally is not engaged. The next is Jewish complicity in racism. And these are historical moments where, you don't have to necessarily own slaves, but if you are benefiting in a system, you are complicit if you're silent, right? That's where you need to be an upstander. And then the third one is the most challenging for folks, which is benefiting from racism. Which, I go to 7-Eleven, I'm not followed, I didn't do anything walking into 7-Eleven, about not being followed, but the moment I do that, I am actually benefiting. And my sense is that this is just a new consciousness for a whole lot of us in the white Jewish community to understand how deep this goes and how causal it is in understanding America. Because it's a consciousness that I think only in the last couple of years we're beginning to start to look at.
So you've talked a bit about the kind of the rhetoric of the Black Power movement and some of the philosophies and beliefs and the ways in which that has shaped the Jewish response. So Nancy Sinkoff asked, though, can you speak more directly to the issue of violence, both strategic and performative, by Black Power and a response by the Jewish community?
Yeah, thank you. And Nancy is a distinguished colleague of mine, so it's good to hear your question. Wow, violence, I did not examine it in particular, and it is really critical. Part of white Jewish liberalism in the post-war era was this consensus idea that everybody could get along if we only could educate and learn from one another. So it was all about Dr. King and Gandhi's idea of nonviolent protest. So steeped deeply within Jewish conceptions of liberal politics is an anti-violence idea. And the moment that violence begins to emerge, it really seeks to, I think, go against American exceptionalism, not just American Jewish. Like America is a place where we don't have violence, that's at least that's the idea. So when violence begins to occur in the mid-1960s in urban America, I think I think it's safe to say that the broad, white American Jewish reaction to it is to see this as an assault on the very notion of pluralist democracy. To push it one step further, we'll go to Amir Kahane, because he was okay with violence, and that's where he centered himself. And as I said, he also borrowed from Black Panthers, and he was coming from more of a even farther to the right of revisionist Zionists to say, guess what, Jews? This whole idea about America as the melting pot, right, as Jonathan said, where everyone's going to be okay, ain't going to be that way, and you got to pick up a weapon and fight and to quote Malcolm X, by any means necessary if you need to do it. And he was really purged to the margins for the idea that he was willing to embrace violence.
I want to pose the question that Bruce asks, and this is to return to some of the comments that you made about Jews of color. He says, does your work deal with Landing's theory or with Black Judaism as a movement that has shaped civil rights? This was new to me, so I'll just say what he added to this. Landing apparently argued that much of the rhetoric of Black nationalism in the 1960s derived from Black Jewish preaching and ideas in the 1930s through 1950s, and that scholars have underplayed the role of Black Judaism.
Yeah, thank you. I don't do it, and that's really what my epilogue is also about. I think that'd be a great book, and I think that's an important sort of next step for where we need to go. And I like it especially because we're going before World War II. Most of what I'm doing is sort of a Cold War America thing. Hasia Diner has written on Blacks and Jews from 1919, I believe, is when she starts. So she may have something, and it's called In the Almost Promised Land is her book. But I would hope that this notion of re-understandings would lead to that kind of research.
So Leon Ashton wants to know, did the white Jewish communities deal with any culture washing during this time period of acceptance?
Culture washing? I don't know what that means. You have or maybe you can offer more on culture washing. I can make something up, but I may not be answering his question. So
when I looked it up, it says when organizations pretend to have a strong and vibrant culture, while the culture that actually thrives within their walls is completely different from the one that is put forward.
Oh yes, that's so cynical. I love it. Yeah, of course, I think so, because this is really for me, it's the historical memory argument. Which is that we've had sort of a dominant memory of what was going on, and that really stuck. And what I'm trying to do in the book is not only undo that memory, but also show that the people living it at the time didn't have the memory. Like we changed their own realities that they said in order to, in my mind, create a narrative that worked for the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, rather than accurately describe what was going on in the 50s and 60s.
Mark, I have to say you're extraordinary. Maybe when you do 120 Zoom sessions, you begin to learn to answer incredibly complicated questions with greater simplicity than most professors are capable of. But so we've actually answered every question that was posed, which I've been to a few Zoom sessions, not 120. But I've never actually been able to get through all the questions that were posted in the Q&A. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of sum things up for us, since I think that we'll close out. You've covered an enormous amount of ground. And I guess I want to do so by just asking you, perhaps in a slightly different way, to reflect for us in closing about where we are, because I've heard kind of two different messages that I see as somewhat in tension tonight that you've expressed. On the one hand, you've asked us to consider a revision of the sort of dominant narrative about Blacks and Jews in the context of the civil rights movement, and that doing so should give us pause in perhaps rethinking the nature of our alliances. And then on the other hand, you've sort of suggested, actually, it's incumbent, especially for white Jews, to think about issues of complicity in their relationship to white supremacy and to become active and get involved, to learn about what the DEI efforts are and anti-racist initiatives are within whatever institutions they are a part of, and to figure out how they can become allies in the struggle to transform the history of racism in America. Can you reprise for us in closing, perhaps a couple of the lessons that you think are important to take away from the conversation that we've had tonight about your book?
Yeah, thank you. And first, I appreciate the, I'm going to take as a compliment that I give short answers, because I know professors get a very bad rap for just going on, especially if we have an audience that is not solely scholars. So first I want to, out myself as a white Jewish man, and to say that I'm often asked like what I think is going on now. And I actually don't think it's my place to say, because I'm not positioned around all of this as a person or even as my career to say anything. And the moment I start, I'm going back to my past, thinking that, things are much better. So I'll give you a positive and a negative, right? I think that the racial reckoning, and I will speak now with my research, is unlike anything we saw in the 50s and 60s. And I think a lot of this had to do with social media and COVID and the previous president of the United States. I think those three combined to really activate people. And folks were coming face to face with systems of racial oppression in ways that in the 50s and 60s, they didn't have to. So that's the good news, right? And just speaking now for, just talking to all these different audiences, I'm feeling good, right? So I check in with Jews of color, every chance I can to get feedback and learning. And I'm like, tell me where are you at? And they're like, we'll see how it goes. That tends to be the answer I'm getting, which is, white supremacy and systems of anti-Black oppression in particular are woven into the fabric of society in a way that structures and systems need to change, not just people's feelings about them. So the issue is, how do we translate the feeling and the knowledge and the learning to actually undoing systems? Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. There's a lot of truth to that. I think he wrote that 1857-ish. So today, I think there's going to be, I think, a white Jewish backlash among really good, well-intentioned, learning-filled people, which is like, okay, like I'm in up to this, but I'm not, I'm not willing to go there to the next step. I'll just give you some data. This is number 125, I think, on Zooms. In the last 4 months, I've done 3. It is all but ended, in terms of congregations being interested. The flip side is I'm pretty much all now talking with national Jewish organizations on the white Jewish side. Like I've got my piece, like my lane in terms of what I do as a scholar. So I'm hopeful that's going to be, I'm hopeful, all I can be is hopeful that that's going to be effective when we're looking at institutional changes. And as I sort of sit on various DEI committees and Jewish organizations here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I'm just kind of watching as we continue sort of to move along, and then a little blip comes up that nobody thinks is racist, but it turns out it's racist. And then we all talk about how is that little thing racist, but you didn't even think about it. And then what are we going to do about it? That's the real moment. And I think it takes a lot of work to even get to there. And I don't think we're there yet.
Marc, thanks so much. Thanks so much for doing this. And thank you so much to the Memphis Jewish Community Center for including you in the course of their programming and for partnering with we at Rhodes College. Justin, I really appreciated doing this panel with you. So thank you to all of you for being with us tonight for what was really an incredibly rich, very dense, and interesting conversation. We really appreciate your insight and perspective, Dr. Dollinger. Thank you.
Thank you.